Hello, welcome back to the second video for introducing you to the B2B PI to CPI integration suite migration. So here we are now taking the next step of after first, which might have watched in the first video, you started at least the preparation for your migration by first finding out the scope of partners and message types that you plan to migrate, perhaps something that you have based on an overview of agreements that you might have in your PI system. So you can see here we have a bunch of agreements in our PI trade partner management. And if we then said, well, we are interested in orders, we are interested in the inbound orders. And in this case, we said, well, we were interested in Bauhaus and see what type of um, agreement we have with them. And here our agreement is to exchange X12 850 5010 version. So if we go back to our integration suite, we can then see what do we have in here. Now, FIGAF has also worked on a naming convention, which shows you most of the details from the specific message implementation guideline. Now, you have to create the message implementation guidelines. It's not a question of whether you like to use MAGs or not, the mapping guidelines or not. The message implementation guidelines are absolutely mandatory for you to even create B2B scenarios. So the naming convention, yes, we have put all the information in there. You can say, is it overkill to say you have all the information that you have as properties of the message? But this is also to prepare for the MAX, where there's also an idea of following a naming convention that will allow you more transparency. If we look here, for example, then we say, well, we know we're talking about the 850, and we can see we have two here, and we've already created two. We have version 4010 and 5010. Notice also it specified whether this is with an envelope, just as you might say you can have some without an envelope. Here you can see, for example, excuse me, we have a functional acknowledgement without envelope. So we have our message type in place. That's the key thing. If we look again at the 5010 that we have here, let's say we said like, oh, we don't have this in place, or rather, well, actually we want it, but we would like it without envelope, which is not in place. Now, for my sake, I'm just going to copy this name because basically that's the same. But what you see here is you see this is specifying the type system, then with a colon. Then you get the message type, the full message type, including the name. Then again a colon, and then you get now here the type system version, then a colon, and then you get a specification of here envelope. Is it with envelope or without envelope? Colon. Then we use the one to indicate that this is the highest level. Meaning, what do we mean by the highest level? The highest level is global. And it's basically just to make sure that they're sorted in that respect. So if you start making partner specific or subset message implementation guidelines, you can then create them as a level 2 or level 3, or however you want to then give these different levels. But at least we know that the global one is level 1. That will always be the first one. And also, the definition, the guideline that we have put up is to say that you make sure that the global is the complete structure. Because often when you create these message implementation guidelines, you get sort of some of these segments are not selected. It's selecting some of them and then some saying, and maybe not, this is not so relevant or new or whatever. To be honest, I don't know exactly why they're not always all selected. But at least here with the global, we want to ensure that all possible fields and segments that are included in the standard definition are all selected and included. So we have this here. Let's then say, yeah, we also want one without envelope. Now, then you have to go in and create your X12, for example. You said, well, what I need is my 850. It'll go with that. And I know I need the 5010 version. It will come with that. And here is one of the selections where it then says, do you want to go with envelope or without envelope? Now, why do we have this selection? There's probably several reasons, but one that is very clear from an SAP migration point of view here is that depending, and this is basically only really relevant for the outbound EDI, but for the outbound EDI, if you select with envelope. The envelope has to be mapped by yourself in your mapping program, whatever, whether you use mapping guidelines, MAGs, or whether you use some of your own iFlow and message mapping or so on. You have to do the complete mapping yourself. If you select without envelope for outbound, the TPM system will populate the envelope for you using the TPM configuration, like your agreements or whatever you have in place. So it is, I would say there's some argument for sometimes creating both with and without envelope for outbound message types. So you say, well, depending on what kind of setup we have today or how we actually prefer to determine our identifiers, we want to use either with or without envelope. But you then have to make that decision based on how is it going to be populated via your mapping program by yourself or via SAP standard using just the TPM framework of saying, like, I've already defined an agreement. Basically, all the details are in there. Do we want the acknowledgements? Is this a test system? Is this, what's our send ID? What's our receive ID? And all of that will be automatically populated if you have chosen one without envelope. Now, in this case, you can argue, and I'm just going to skip the example for now, that you can say, now I just save this one. So here I can say, now we have created one without envelope. You can then ask, why ever create it with envelope? But for inbound, you don't have the same requirement for uh, basically determining the envelope yourself, because it's already there, of course. So there it makes sense to have it, because you might actually have information in the envelope you want to use in your mapping programs and whatever. And then it is helpful to then have the definition with envelope. But I would then say without envelope, I can again, you can play it safe and just say, well, I can use this for both, right? But now I'm just going to say that in this case, I'm just going to say this one we're going to use for only outbound, and say, well, without envelope, I only want to use for outbound. We have a business scenario here, and we then say a business process, sorry, a business context, and we say then the business process, and we say, well, it's some side of ordering, so we can say I want to create an order. Um, you can also use it to manage a purchase order, but now since this is inbound, sorry, so this would be an outbound purchase order. We can use it for that and say, yeah, this would be okay processes. It then creates it. And here, as you can see, a lot of them are not selected by default. Actually, very few are selected by default. So here you can either go through it and say, what is it? But since what do we want to use this for? And adjust your MIG to reflect exactly the process you want to support. But in this case, we say this is our level 1 global. So here we just select all and save that. And activate. So let's say that this was the MIG you wanted to use for your migration. Of course, you then also say, well, what we want to do also is sending in an inbound IDOC, and we're using, for example, orders 05. And we can see there that we do have an order 05 created. Again, note again, it's all the same details that we have here in our naming convention, but we can then see, yeah, but it has to be, of course, checked that are we up to this level? Is this the correct level that we're using, and so on, and check these things. This has to match and be exactly a match. This is part of the IDOC envelope. So especially for outbound messages, it's going to be important that you have this set correctly, the IDOC type system version, because it will match down to the version of your IDOC. And this will be populated by any SAP system for outbound IDOCs. Now, Max, to use or not to use. In this case, we said, well, we want to migrate operation mapping. We want to preserve and reuse that mapping, and that's I think is a good valid point. We have other videos where we discuss why you want to do this, and here I just want to show you that there can be some benefits in creating your max anyways. So if we look here at the that I have here, you can see here that we have the 850. I have here 3 different max in place already. we have the 4010 to an orders IDOC. We have the 4010 to a SOAP service, enterprise service request. And we have the 5010 already a MAG in place. Now, there can be some benefits in doing this. This will help you when it comes to creating your agreement templates, which will then help you when you create your agreements. Because in your agreements, the specifying the mix is absolutely mandatory. And you can do that when you create your template. You can start go in there and say this template business scenario reflects this MIG, and then you can say the sender MIG, the receiver MIG, and all that. But if you have a MAG in place, you can just assign the MAG, and then the mix will be automatically determined. And there's some stability in that. There's some benefit in that, and it will get you started in getting some introduction to the MAG. And it would then also mean that basically your preferred mapping, or put it another way, you will then start your agreement by saying we will define our agreement using SAP best practice, using MIGs, using MAGs. But then as part of our migration, we will say, I will also then now inject a operation mapping iFlow that we have then created based on a PI mapping. So my argument would be that it's a good idea to create your mags. And when you create your mags, like, you don't have to go in there and say, okay, then I'm not sure I know how to map it and whatever. You can just create it just saying, just this is the source and this is the target message. So let's just say, for example, we want to do one also without envelope. So I'm just go in here and I create a standard in this case. In this case, then I say, well, now I want to do my orders, and I can see it already up here, without envelope. The target is still going to be my IDOC, and then you basically then have the name here. And this is why I think, and this is part of the reason for the naming convention of the mix, is that then by SAP standard, you get a proposed naming convention or name for your max that I believe is much more usable. Now, one part of this standard from SAP I don't like is that they put mapping in front. I don't think you have to call a mapping mapping. So again, our recommendation would be to remove that. That's just redundant information, in my opinion. So what we have here is the full description of what precisely is this MAC doing. And that's why the MIGs are named the way they are, because then when you have 20 different developers working on 2,000 migrations or 2,000 mapping programs or 2,000, whatever you might have, if you make these suddenly partner specific, you will at least have a uniform naming convention for your Macs, and you would understand what each Mac precisely is doing and reflecting. And there are other ways you can search this out when you look at it, but as we will show you later in one of the other videos, you can now in FIGAF also get a complete overview of what's happening, and what also this is important to how are you going to name your agreements and your business scenarios in TPM. And there is some reuse potential here, and that's part of the reason for this name. Anyways, you see now here immediately we say, well, fine, we have then our MAG in place. And then you can just say, fine, maybe next year we'll do this. For now, we just say save, and we're happy that we have our guideline. And that's it, because this will help you when you start looking at your agreement templates, which will be the topic of the next video. So now you have your mix and your max in place, which means basically you only need now to look at your templates before you can start your migration. But that will be in the next video. Thank you for watching.